Everyone, in today's episode, I'll discuss what to buy and where to buy. I'm going to keep it pretty simple because it's a pretty simplistic kind of video. So let's just get started with what to buy. There's a couple components here that I want to get into. First of all, houses versus units. Second of all, capital cities versus regional centres. And then finally, demographics and gentrification. Let's have a quick look at just houses and units. And this is just a report from CoreLogic. And you can see clearly here the difference between houses and units. Just first of all, on the actual worm there, or should I say the line graph, you can see clearly combined capitals have done very well, and regionals have done not too badly either. Then following that, you've basically got the combined capitals in units and also the combined regionals in units. But over time, if you look in the early 90s, they were actually very close together, very, very similar. And that can only be better demonstrated through this actual table from RP Data CoreLogic, again through Aussie Home Loans 25-year report. So you can see basically on the left, you got housing values, and then on the right, you've got unit values. So these are between the years of 1993 and 2018. So it's over quite a long period, and it's pre-COVID as well, which I like because that COVID once in a generation kind of boom hasn't kind of, changed the prices too much as it did in the market over that COVID period. But you can see basically here in every single capital city and in the national chart too, houses outperform units in every single one of them. There's not a single one where units outperformed houses. So, especially if you look at Sydney and Melbourne, there's like 1.5% difference between them. In some other cities, even more. There's 2.2% in Darwin, and the closest actually there, from what I can see, is probably Adelaide or Perth, where you've got 0.7% difference, but it's still 0.7% greater growth in houses than there is units. Let's just have a quick look at capitals versus regionals. Now, I'll keep it pretty simple here. This is again just CoreLogic's 30-year report. So here's your top statistical area 3 areas for growth. And you'll notice here that basically all of them are in the city. They're basically all in the CBD. And they're predominantly Sydney and Melbourne here. So the only real other ones that aren't Sydney and Melbourne here is basically one small area of the ACT. So that's the inner part of the ACT. So basically around near where Parliament is, not very far from there. And then obviously you got the inner east and sort of inner suburbs of Brisbane / inner north of Brisbane just there. But these areas, they're not necessarily council regions, but they equate to basically what council regions are. Now, look, in Melbourne, they're pretty much council regions. In Brisbane, obviously, Brisbane City Council takes up like almost the entire city or the entire catchment, aside from pretty much Moreton Bay and Logan councils of Brisbane. But if you look here, you can clearly see it's predominantly Sydney and Melbourne where all the best growth has happened, and the inner parts of Brisbane. So that should give you some pretty clear sort of knowledge as to why capitals outperform regionals as well, just in graphs. So here's an example of the regionals. So you can see just alone on the difference between the two, that like there's only really one region that would actually kind of like /2 regions that actually make that. So it's basically Huon-Bruny Island and then Broadbeach to Burleigh. So when I say Broadbeach to Burleigh, it's literally, just along the coastline from Broadbeach to Burleigh. That's kind of what this area is. So it's kind of like your most expensive area of the coast. Huon and Bruny Island's an interesting one because it has grown a lot, but it doesn't really have much fundamentals to continue growing there. Interesting ones here that you won't pick up is just Newcastle and Wollongong, and then also Geelong. That would go under probably Bellarine here, but these areas actually performed quite well as well. So the reason it doesn't show up though is because these areas actually encapsulate so much more than just the kind of city area. When I talk about Newcastle, I mean Newcastle City. I mean basically nowhere west kind of sort of North Lambton, sort of Wallsend, kind of not nowhere west of that, but Newcastle goes right out, literally towards like the boundary of Cessnock, basically to the highway, which is pretty poor growth area. But I mean, I don't really buy it, mind you, when I talk about Newcastle and I say that's the area, I wouldn't buy anywhere probably further than about 5 or 6 Ks from the CBD, because it's completely different to Sydney and Melbourne, where you can comfortably buy, 15 Ks and still get a pretty good suburb. In Newcastle, you can't buy any more than 5. No different to Wollongong. There's definitely different areas in Wollongong. So the north is much better. Especially for capital growth. So that's another thing just to consider. But if you look at this graph compared to the last, you can see that literally only 2 areas out of the 20 would actually make it into there. And one of them, I don't even think I'd actually count, because it's just some kind of abnormal growth, and it doesn't have the right fundamentals to continue doing so. So that's capital cities versus regionals. Let's just go into it. So look, one of the large reasons why I say an area like Huon, Bruny Island can't do as well is simply because it doesn't have the demographics long term to do well. Now, sure, they can hold stock long, which is good, and sure, they might have massive parcels of land. But the truth of the matter is, if there's no jobs, no sort of employment infrastructure there, longer term, and diversified industries, it's not going to do well longer term. So I'll give you an exact example of this. So this is just in Brisbane, and it's just the top performing suburbs. So you'll see, I'll just read out the first 10 suburbs: Bulimba, New Farm, Hawthorn, Seven Hills, Grange, Camp Hill, Paddington, Hamilton, West End, Norman Park. Now, all of these, even literally 11 to 20, also sit in the same area. So they all literally sit in the inner east and inner north of Brisbane. That's where they all sit, basically all of these, aside from pretty much Ashgrove. But Ashgrove's basically on the borderline of the inner north, because you count Newmarket as the inner north, but Ashgrove neighbours Newmarket. So it's very close, mind you, as well. So that's basically where all the best suburbs are. And if I just show you where all the money is in Brisbane, this is where it all is. So you can see basically the inner east and the inner north in those sort of blue patches and sort of light greeny kind of teal patches there. That's where basically your money is. Now, sure, you do have towards the bottom sort of left bend of the river down there. That's kind of like Fig Tree Pocket down that way. That is an area with quite a bit of money too, but predominantly the money. But that area is quite expensive. They're on quite large blocks down towards Fig Tree Pocket. Quite a few politicians live down that way, but predominantly the inner north and inner east of Brisbane is where all the money is. And you can see the blue sort of patches there. And the reason for that is because all the jobs are there, basically. All the jobs in Brisbane are pretty much around that CBD. You've got obviously the city, you've got Fortitude Valley, you've got smaller parts around Hamilton, smaller parts around Newmarket. Obviously the Hurston Medical Precinct's another one. And then you've obviously got Woolloongabba, South Bank. Then you've also got some smaller ones at Cannon Hill and around there too. So that's your predominant job areas in Brisbane. But that's the whole reason why you get that kind of, that's why you get the good growth around those suburbs. It's simply because all the money is around that area, and that's the reason. So that's the reason I'm saying somewhere like that can gentrify, somewhere like Huon, Bruny Island can't, because it doesn't have the right demographics to continue growing at the same rate. But anyway, let's get into another area, and this is just going through a bit of gentrification, and this is in a region called Maribyrnong in Melbourne. So these are Melbourne's top performing suburbs. So I'll just go through the Maribyrnong ones here. So you'll see Kingsville's there, you'll see Braybrook, Yarraville, and you'll also see Seddon there too. If you looked at the top 100 suburbs, it would actually include Footscray and West Footscray. They both grew at around 9.6% as well. So alone just on that, you've got that's 6 of, I think, the 10 suburbs in the council region that are actually in, Australia's top performing 100 suburbs in this report. So, but the reason for that really is it's just simply the income growth in the area. So here alone is just an example, and this is one of my favorite suburbs to buy. It's one I target very regularly, and it's Yarraville. So you'll look just between the 15 years of 2006 and 2021, you've got, about nearly 2.5xing income just in that period alone. Most areas in Australia, simply grew at about probably 60% rather than 250. So if you look at this, you can see the change in demographics. And I mean, that income is comparable with like some of Sydney's inner west and some of the upper north shore of Sydney. And I mean, you're picking up properties for around, 900,000 to about 1.2 million. So it's just crazy. Like, these are better demographics than Marrickville. And it's probably a similar suburb to Marrickville in Sydney, but you got much higher, growth than Marrickville, and it's much cheaper, even when Marrickville had very poor demographics. So definitely something to consider, but that's a large reason why obviously Yarraville's done so well and it's gentrified, and the Maribyrnong region has done very well over time. So just to recap, like I said, what you obviously need is demographics there, and that can occur through gentrification. So that's why Brisbane's inner north, inner suburbs, and inner east have done very well. And that's why the Maribyrnong region has done very well, because you've got the right demographics moving into the area at the moment. So just consider that. If people are wanting to buy in these areas, please reach out, because I do mention the suburbs, but you have to buy the right property in these suburbs, and it's very hard to if you don't know the area well. So I'd advise to, if you have the ability to. Let's get into where to buy. So there's a couple of points I just want to make, and they're very simple. First of all, what you want to do is, number one, follow the money. Second of all, what you want to do is know whether the area is an existing good area to buy or it's a gentrifying area. Another thing you want to do is also buy in a well-diversified economy, and then also where multinational businesses may have vested interests. What I mean by a lot of this too is where there's also a raw undersupply of stock is often where a good area to buy is. So the reason for this is because supply and demand is basically the underlying largest metric for price growth. So here's an example of just two suburbs in Sydney. And the reason I want to show everyone this is because a lot of people, for some odd reason, I don't know why, have an absolute obsession with buying in Western Sydney because there's new estates and new infrastructure and all that kind of thing going on out there. But I'll show you an example here. Clovelly versus Tallawong. So for those that don't know where Tallawong is, it's out towards sort of Schofield's Marsden Parkway. And I'm telling you right now, it's an awful place to buy. You're buying places where like $1.2 to $1.7 million, and it's surrounded by just estates and acres and acres and acres of land that's about to be rezoned into new lots. So the issue I have here is a lot of people are basically completely, swayed by the COVID boom, which really is a once in a generation boom where you could have thrown a dartboard at Australia and made like 30%, literally. So a lot of people think they've made 30 to 50% or something like that out here, and they think they know what they're talking about, but continue buying here. But the fact of the matter is this area is going to do probably like longer term, maybe 5 to maybe 6.5% at max. Whereas if you had the money to buy somewhere better, now sure, okay, I'm not saying everyone can afford Clovelly because it's like $5 million, but if you look at the stock here, there's like 4 or 5 properties on the market in the whole suburb, right? Now, where do you think it's going to go up more in price? Somewhere with 150 properties on the market? Because if you look at the Tallawong map there, you've got some areas with multiple for sale, and you've got new land actually, being built out this way too. So that's the other issue you got as well. Or somewhere with all set supply like Clovelly. You can't create any more lots in Clovelly unless you knock down something and then subdivide it, but most of it's already been done. Like, there's barely any land to build on in all of these suburbs. So look, I'm not saying everyone can afford Clovelly, but there's better options. If you had like enough money to buy in Tallawong, you could buy in like Melbourne or Brisbane's absolute premium end that's done like 9 or more % capital growth over the long term. So just have a little bit of a think about that and don't buy in these crappy areas. Look, another thing you want to do is buy in regions with low mortgage stress. So, and that, 100% is not new estates or low income suburbs. So I'm just going to show you, this is just from Digital Finance Analytics in August of 24. And these are just your top, basically 10 postcodes where they had the highest levels of mortgage stress. So you'll see Liverpool, Campbelltown, Tapping, Toowoomba, Camden, Narrawarren, Roxburgh Park, Pakenham and Berwick, and also Ballarat. Now, if you look at this, you'll notice that basically there's predominantly suburbs with a high density of apartments or on the outer fringes where, you'd have new estates or lower socioeconomic demographic people live. So your new estates, obviously Berwick, Pakenham, Roxburgh Park. Obviously on the outskirts of Narrowon, you have a few. You also have a few in Camden on the outskirts, a few in Toowoomba, and not far from Tapping either. Liverpool, Campbelltown are both areas that do have a lower socioeconomic demographic, and so is Ballarat. So do not buy in these areas, people. Don't fall the absolute nonsense that developers will tell you or overseas companies will tell you, because it just doesn't work. It's as simple as that. Stats don't lie. You can't bring feelings in the stats, because they will just tell you the pure truth. And if you're seeing like stuff like this, like sure, Roxburgh Park has 46% mortgage stress, which is ridiculous. That's almost 1 in every 2 households has mortgage stress, which is insanity. But some of these have like 90% or even above 70 is ridiculous. Like, how can you justify buying a suburb with 90% mortgage stress? Like, what happens if a GFC style event happens? Everyone has to sell their house, everyone in the suburb. Like, what's going to happen with prices then? So don't fall for that absolute nonsense you see. Look at stats, and this is one of them you do have to keep an eye on. You ideally want that mortgage stress to be as close to zero as possible, and predominantly in the good suburbs, it's usually under 3%. So these are all like minimum 20 to 30 times what it should be at minimum. Look, another thing you want to do is buy in advantaged regions. So what does an advantaged region mean? So this is just basically off the government website. So it's actually off the social economic index. Everyone can look it up if they want to. But basically your dark blue areas are the areas that they consider most advantaged, and the red's the least advantaged. And obviously in between is a bit of both. But you want to buy in the areas that are advantaged in every way. So how they kind of calculate that is, number 1 is income, number 2 is jobs, number 3 is lifestyle and access, number 4 is facilities, and then there's obviously a few other smaller things that are added there too. So facilities, for example, schools go into that. Access, for example, transport goes into that. There's a lot of different things that go into it, but it's predominantly around the obviously demographics of the area and safety of the area, and then what access you have. So you can clearly see in Sydney, it's obviously the North Shore and eastern suburbs have the best advantage in Sydney, and then it's obviously followed by probably, I'd say, your Sutherland Shire and then your affluent inner west areas. And as you go further out west and the further you get towards the more lower socioeconomic areas and housing estates, you'll see it obviously goes quite dramatically down there. But you want to buy in these advantaged regions as well. Look, a lot of people ask me all the time where to buy. It's pretty simple. Sydney and Melbourne are predominantly the best areas to buy. So I'm just listing here the number of suburbs I actually have considered in the past. So you see Melbourne, then Sydney 52, 51. Brisbane then's got about 22. Perth, Newcastle have 15 and 11. The Central Coast, Geelong, Wollongong 9, 8 and 7. Look, I can add, if people really want me to, the Gold Coast and Sunny Coast there. The Gold Coast, I really only consider about 5 suburbs in the whole Gold Coast, and the Sunny Coast about 4 to 5, depending on where the market's at any point in time. But that's where basically you should really buy. Look, in saying that though, another thing you want to consider is just the property clock and where suburbs are at. And I don't mean the things put out on Heron Todd White. I mean in the general trend of where the market's at. So a couple of episodes, I put out something called the property clock for each city. If anyone wants to check it out, just search it up. It'll come up straight away on my actual page. And this is basically where we're at for each property market and end of the cycle. So again, I said I like Brisbane and Perth, but they're obviously a lot further along in their growth cycle than somewhere like Melbourne, Geelong, Newcastle, Sydney, the Central Coast, or Wollongong. So obviously you are well into the growth cycle, so that means it is going to obviously stabilise at some point and probably go through a little bit of a dip as well, and then that might take a number of years. So if you're investing for 10 years, they are not actually the best cities to buy, and there is better options, definitely. So just consider that as well when you're looking as into what to buy, because it does really matter. It does actually have a massive effect on the long-term capital growth of your actual assets. So just consider that, and it's just something I think everyone should think about when buying, especially making such a big investment in their life. Anyway, we're getting to the end of this episode, but first of all, I just want to thank everyone for watching, and please subscribe to this channel because I have thousands of basically viewers, but for some reason, I guess a lot of people don't subscribe, so please be one of the ones who do. And also for those who are actually interested in buying, just reach out through my website. You can book a free call and consultation through my website. Just go to the links in the actual description below. And I've actually got this thing on my website now called Premier Properties. So what that is properties that actually return a total return of 13% and above. And that's obviously an estimated return. So it's your 30-year long-term capital growth of CoreLogic plus your immediate gross rental yield. The importance of having such a high capital growth in this though, which is what I generally aim for, usually somewhere between at least 8% or above in terms of capital growth, is because over the long term yield slides down. So because of that, what happens is capital growth will generally do in your best suburbs somewhere between 7 and 10%. Yield can only do between 3 and 4%. Now, over the long term, what happens then is one exponentially outdoes the other, and that is the growth to the price of an asset. So because that happens, what then happens is yield slides down, but that's exactly what you want because you're obviously getting a percentage of the asset value, hence you want the asset value to go up, which is what nearly every buyer's agent in the country and the world actually lies about. But anyway, that's the reason you actually want the capital growth component to be higher, because if you did an IRR, or should I say internal rate of return for those engineering spreadsheet people, and I have engineer clients, mind you, what you'll see is if you have a makeup of, let's say, 9% capital growth and 4% yield, your total return over 30 years will be something between probably 11 and 12%, something like that. Whereas if you had 6% capital growth and 6%, let's say, or even 7% yield, your total return is 100% going to be below 10% because of the yield sliding down over the long term. That's the reason. So just keep out for that. Click on my site. Feel free to book me. And thanks again, everyone, for watching. Have a great day ahead.